Someone I've known and respected for years, former FBI profiler John Douglas, a real pioneer in the science. John, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Jim.
Let's get right to the note. A lot of people believe it was written by a woman. What do you think?
We can't make that determination. Unfortunately, some of the top experts who I contacted said they cannot determine whether or not it was authored by either a male or a female.
Huh. So John Douglas can't tell whether the ransom note's written by a male or a female. You know, once upon a time, I had oodles of respect for John Douglas, the man who inspired the Jack Crawford character in one of my favorite films, The Silence of the Lambs.
When I told that sheriff we shouldn't talk in front of a woman, that really burned you, didn't it? It was just smokes, darling. I had to get rid of him.
Matters, Mr. Crawford. Cops look at you to see how to act. Matters.
Point taken.
And that's true, been true in a general sense as well. People have looked to John Douglas for thought leadership in the Ramsey case. In fact, it was because of John Douglas that when I first came to the Ramsey case, I did so with my tail between my legs. I felt very intimidated, totally out of my depth, thinking there was no way I could possibly contribute anything to this case, given the heavy hitters, legends in law enforcement, like Douglas especially, but also Lou Smith, as well as investigative heavyweights like Paula Woodward, Carol McKinley, Charlie Brennan, and Lawrence Schiller. Even Joe Kender didn't seem to think there was much that could be done to shift the needle, one way or the other.
Well, it's widely known that the Ramseys hired you as an expert to help them find Jean Bonnet's killer. You've been inside this investigation from the beginning. What's your thoughts? Have the Ramseys something to do with it, or is it somebody else?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In this analysis, we're going to look at John Douglas's assessment of the case as an expert from the FBI, and I'm going to share some of my insights based on what he said and also just my research around this case. Because as I started to navigate this case, as I read more and more about it from different sources, I found, to my astonishment, I disagreed with the great master. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, and I do recommend you watch the other episodes in the Peripheral Figures series. I'll put a link to the playlist in the description. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button. It's my second video today, and let's get started.
John, I was tough on the Ramseys, particularly John Ramsey. At one point I said, John, I said, if you did it, I said, you're one great liar, because I've interviewed some great liars in my life. And I don't believe they did it.
So, I don't know about you, but this was a surprise. Douglas, as far as I was concerned, was hit and miss on a few things in this case.
So many details that's unnecessary in a ransom note, so they did not do it.
That's a valuable opinion, because I know you.
But not everything was a miss, though. It was Douglas who was also the first, or one of the first, to expound the theory that it was an inside job, that it was someone close to the Ramseys that had to have done this.
Has been in the house before, has intimate knowledge about the household, and so therefore we're not looking for a stranger.
We're not looking for a stranger except when we are. Except when we're going after John Mark Carr, who is a stranger, Gary Oliva, who is a stranger, Michael Helgoth, Chris Wolf, and so on, who are all strangers. Early on, I thought, and I still believe, that he was right about that. As for his assessment on the ransom note, I'm not sure I'd even give him a passing grade on that. And yet, based on that and terms like using attaché, and also we advise you to be well rested, he couldn't seem to decide whether it was written by a male or a female. Of course, if this was your first encounter with John Douglas, it was hard not to be impressed with his position, and also it was hard to disagree with someone who apparently had not only expertise but the respect of so many people behind him.
You grilled me pretty hard, as I recall, on the Bureau's Civil Rights record in the Hoover years. I gave you an A.
A-, sir.
Let's see, double major, psych and criminology, graduated Magna, summer internships.
So during my initial foray into the Ramsey case, I was very humble, very meek actually, perhaps a little like Agent Starling. In fact, how I felt was really just...
I have much to learn.
But I do think, even in hindsight, that humility is the most important way to approach not only this case, especially this case, but every case. In any event, I had my doubts I would have anything to contribute to a case this old and this thoroughly dissected by so many. But then, very quickly, at least for me, Douglas's shiny veneer seemed to slip. Not just for me. On January 30th, barely a month after the incident, the Denver Post published an article about Douglas, criticizing Douglas. It was published under the unflattering headline, "Profiler Slipped Up." This is from the Denver Post. In the criminal field, there's a time-tested twist to the adage, behavior is more telling than words. But former FBI profiler John Douglas, who has worked for the family in the JonBenet Ramsey case, he worked for Team Ramsey, he was part of Team Ramsey, seems to have veered from that old principle. So this guy's coming out all guns blazing right from the word go, saying, wow, this guy seems to have gone off track. In his interview with Dateline NBC this week, Douglas has said that his heart tells him that JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy, weren't involved in her murder. Doesn't sound terribly convincing or scientific. And it does make you wonder, what are John Douglas's credentials besides his track record with certain cases? And you might say his track record is sufficient. But in what way was he educated? As far as I know, he worked as a school teacher at a certain point. By the way, so did I, but more kind of in an informal capacity as an economics teacher and as a second language teacher in South Korea. But I think more pertinently, the question is, what is Douglas's aptitude in terms of linguistics, for example, if you're going to talk about the ransom note, for example? And so he felt that John and Patsy, he felt that they weren't involved in the murder. And he relies heavily on his 4.5-hour interview with the couple to reach his conclusion. Well, what is the issue with that? Well, his 4.5-hour interview was with both of them at the same time. If John Ramsey is a liar, Douglas said on national TV, he's one of the best. So he's basically saying, you know, if I've made a mistake, it's not really me that's made a mistake. It's John that is such a skilled dissembler, right? And I don't think one has to be a rocket scientist to figure out aspects of the Ramsey case that don't seem to be true. Recently on this channel, we've already dealt with the Santa Bear. Was it really brought to the house? Was it really something that they'd never seen? Was it really something that didn't belong to JonBenet? We've also dealt with the bowl of pineapple, same thing. And then also an electronic shocking device, right, was apparently brought to the scene, but then not a pen and paper and not a ligature. If you think about it, there's Santa Bear, the pineapple, and the Mindhunter book. These were all said to be items inside the house that the Ramseys themselves couldn't explain or denied that they were there. That's 3 separate items besides the dodgy ransom note itself. You know, if you want to count that as untrustworthy evidence, that's 4 if you count it. The flashlight was also described by the Ramseys as something they didn't recognize. That's 5. The broken window was something the housekeeper said wasn't broken earlier, to the best of her knowledge. If she's right, that's 6. The list goes on. The backpack in John Andrews' room, 7. The rope, 8, and so on. One of the most ironic allegations that came out of, in terms of John Douglas's association with the family, was that some people felt that the Ramseys themselves had used his book, Mindhunter, as a kind of a blueprint for how to get away with a crime. And one of the ways that they dodged or dealt with that allegation was they said, well, we never had that book in our home to begin with. And Lou Smith was actually the person who said, well, we actually have it in crime scene photos. So how do we explain that mystery? Well, I think in the same way that Santa Bear somehow made it to the Ramseys' basement in another state, I think the same can probably apply, possibly applies to Mindhunter. I have dealt with Mindhunter in other episodes, and I'll put links to those episodes at the end of this video, so look out for that. Now, what gave me confidence that my differing from Douglas wasn't naivete or arrogance was the fact that at least 2 other FBI agents associated with this case, Ron Walker, who we've already dealt with,
She had a bedwetting problem, a serious bedwetting problem.
and Greg McCreary.
I suppose we could speculate about that. I mean, why did someone want this child dead?
Now, we haven't dealt with McCreary yet. We will, but the point is both of these men from the FBI disagreed with John Douglas's theory as well. And this was also highlighted in the same article in the Denver Post barely a month after the incident. Let's go back to the article. One of Douglas's former FBI colleagues, Greg McCreary, watched the television interview with more than a passing interest. He turned down the job as the Ramsey family's profiler a couple of weeks ago. And it's also interesting that McCreary was approached before John Douglas. McCreary found some notable flaws in Douglas's profiling work for the Ramseys. And so in the early days of my research, I was relieved that, I wasn't going crazy, that I wasn't the only one that felt that this just didn't really make sense, the assessments that he was coming up with. Back to the article, NBC referred without contradiction from Douglas to the profiler's interview with the parents for 4.5 hours. McCreary said the parents should have been interviewed separately, not jointly, for the profiling work to be valid. Just so. That's always the correct way to do this. It's fundamental, McCreary said. You separate the people, you interview them independently, you lock them into statements, and then you compare. To do otherwise virtually invalidates the effort. And so in a way, we're dealing with basically True Crime 101 and something that, in that sense, Douglas didn't stick to that sort of basic procedure. The article goes further, noting that McCreary wasn't impressed with Douglas's conclusion that John Ramsey was telling the truth. And he went on to say, I've talked to guilty offenders in the penitentiary, and some of them are so manipulative and persuasive that they almost have you believing they didn't do it. That's what he said in the article. Now, this seems to suggest that McCreary had doubts over John Ramsey's honesty, even if John Douglas didn't. Far be it from me to point out that the Boulder grand jury didn't accept Douglas's assessment either, nor Lou Smith's. Why? Because we know they ultimately rejected the intruder theory as a whole, and that aspect seemed to have been kept under wraps for a really long time. Now, McCreary said that evidence at the scene strongly disputes any theory that the killer may have been a disgruntled employee of Ramsey, and that seemed to be Douglas's position, that his most likely suspect was a disgruntled employee of John Ramsey. And think about how that narrative has changed over time. Was Chris Wolf a disgruntled employee? Gary Oliva, disgruntled employee. John Mark Carr, disgruntled employee. And then to make his case, McCreary says this crime was not about getting back at the father. He said, it's not the case of someone killing a kid to get back at a parent, which is in a way what the ransom note seems to imply. He said the essay of JonBenet was a deviant, psychopathic sexual behavior, not an expression of anger at the father. And that really brings up this question, did no one have any anger at John, or even Patsy for that matter? Yeah, I have to say, I don't really quite agree with either of the agents, which shows you just how divisive and some might say psychologically difficult, psychologically tricky this case can be. The idea of killing a kid to get back at a parent isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. This will be controversial, but we see this kind of instrumentality in the Lucy Letby case, where kids, neonatals, are killed to literally get someone else's attention. In the Gannon Store case, it felt a lot like the stepmother did that to get her husband's attention. And in the Chris Watts case, you could argue that it felt like he killed his children so they wouldn't get in the way of his mistress. Not quite the same thing. But in that case, in the context of Nutgate, it did seem like there was something like that afoot. We can also see in his interview with Dr. Phil that Burke seemed almost amused by the distress of his mother when her beloved daughter was gone, when he was describing this moment where she came into his room panicking.
Do you remember waking up that morning?
Yep. The first thing I remember is my mom bursting in my room, really frantic, saying like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. running around my room looking for JonBenet. At that point, I was awake.
Now, I'm not suggesting that Berg did anything here, just that the notion that someone killing a kid to get back at a parent isn't so foreign to the psychology of this case as it might seem. After all, it's in the psychology of the ransom note. The ideas within the ransom note suggest this idea of getting John back because of some or other grievance. So I think one must consider someone enjoying the distress of a parent as a sign of an anal sadistic aspect going on in a particular dynamic, and that's something I'm not sure I've heard anyone else discuss, let alone think about in this case. The last thing I want to say is what I do agree with McCreary, and I have to say I agree with far more of his positions on this case than Douglas, is on this particular point where he says, if revenge on the father had been a motive, the killer would have displayed the body. He wouldn't have hidden it in the basement. The profiler said the body would have been placed in a manner to shock and offend John Ramsey if anger or hate or revenge had been the motive. What's missing in this assessment, though, is that it wasn't necessarily the killer who hid the body away. But I digress. Now, when John Ramsey assembled Team Ramsey, I don't know how much John Douglas was paid, but I'm sure he was worth every cent, whatever that amount was. From the very beginning, up until this year actually, virtually without fail, when John is interviewed, guess whose name he drops? The FBI agent who endorsed his and Patsy's innocence. John refers to John Douglas in their book, which came out about 20 years ago, and on and on and on, all the way to this year.
John Douglas, who's probably the premier crime profiler, started that whole FBI program, crime profiling.
John Douglas, who's a very well-known crime profiler, said he believes it's someone that was either angry at me or jealous of me.
I was told by a very experienced FBI person that most victims of violent crime end up broke.
And as you can imagine, there's a lot more where that came from. So in a real sense, Douglas's authority, credibility, and prestige has played a huge role in shaping the narrative surrounding this case, a narrative that persists to this day. Douglas has also done the same thing for Amanda Knox and the West Memphis 3. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you're enjoying this series on peripheral figures, perhaps learning a few things. Thank you for listening. If you've learned a few things, please do hit the thanks button, and I'll see you guys next time.